Hello, my dear friends. This is the second and final part of the story Betrayal's Price. If you haven't listened to the first part of the story, go to the previous video and listen to the first part so that after that you can continue listening to the final part in this video. Thank you for being with us. We continue. Betrayal's Price, Part 2. Elizabeth's resolve to endure shifted subtly into strategy. By the fourth week, silence and humiliation no longer felt sustainable. She needed acknowledgement, some sign from Mark that she wasn't invisible. Pride and desperation drove her thoughts into dangerous territory. She started small. When delivering reports to his office, she lingered an extra moment, hoping he would speak. She carefully chose her attire each morning, recalling what he once admired. She volunteered for assignments that brushed closer to his department, imagining that proximity would spark recognition. But Mark remained unmoved. He accepted her reports with a nod, eyes never lifting from the page. In meetings, his gaze swept over her as though she were no more significant than the numbers projected on the screen. Each failed attempt chipped away at her composure, leaving her raw and restless. One afternoon, she forced herself to speak during a team discussion. Her idea was practical, rooted in efficiency, but her voice trembled under the weight of so many watching eyes. A few colleagues dismissed her outright. One even smirked, muttering that she was trying to impress the boss. Mark, however, responded only with a curt, professional, "Noted. Let's move on." It wasn't cruelty. Not exactly. It was worse. Detached acknowledgement, the kind given to any stranger. Elizabeth returned to her desk, her chest burning. Every attempt to reclaim a sliver of his attention had failed, but she was not ready to surrender. If Mark's indifference was a fortress, then she would find the cracks in its walls. Because one truth gnawed at her relentlessly: she could not bear to remain invisible. Elizabeth's attempts to claw back a place in Mark's world had become painfully obvious. She arrived at the office before the sun rose, folders neatly aligned, coffee already brewed, her posture stiff with discipline. By evening, when the corridors emptied and computer screens flickered to black, she remained, eyes fixed on her work, yet ears straining for the sound of his door opening. Mark gave her nothing. He passed by her desk without hesitation, spoke to her with the same clipped courtesy he used on any subordinate, and weighed her reports with unflinching impartiality. To outsiders, it was professionalism. To Elizabeth, it was punishment, sharpened by the memory of years when his voice had been tender and his eyes warm. Her colleagues noticed. They no longer lowered their voices when she walked into the break room. "Still trying to impress him," someone whispered with open disdain. Another chuckled, "Doesn't she get it? He's done with her." Their laughter carried, and Elizabeth, cheeks burning, forced herself to smile as though she hadn't heard. One evening, she created her chance. Mark's office light still burned, casting long shadows across the floor. She clutched a folder, irrelevant, unnecessary, and knocked softly. His calm gaze rose when she entered, but his face revealed nothing. "I thought you might need this for tomorrow's meeting," she murmured, her voice carrying both hope and fear. He accepted the file with a nod. "Thank you. That will be all." Her courage wavered, but desperation broke through. "Mark," she whispered, the name trembling on her lips. His eyes lifted, cold, piercing, and unrelenting.
In that single glance, she felt the weight of every choice she had made, every bridge she had burned. The silence suffocated her. Words failed. Finally, she whispered, "Good night," and slipped out, her pulse thrumming with shame. Outside, the night air bit at her skin. She told herself she had gained something. He had looked at her, truly looked, even if the look had frozen her to the core. That spark of contact fed the fragile hope she clung to. But Mark's silence was not indifference. It was strategy. He understood her desperation, her every maneuver. The fortress of his composure would not fall to pleading glances or whispered names. It would stand, until the moment he chose to dismantle it.
The office atmosphere had shifted since Margaret's arrival. Whispers trailed her in the hallways, and though she tried to keep her chin high, Thomas could see the cracks in her composure. He remained professional, treating her as he would any other employee, but he knew she felt the weight of his presence with every step she took. Margaret, however, had a different strategy. She began dressing more elegantly, carefully applying makeup in the mornings, and wearing the same perfume she had once chosen for their anniversaries. She laughed louder at company dinners, positioned herself closer to Thomas during meetings, and occasionally let her hand rest just a second too long on the back of his chair. It was a performance, and Thomas recognized it instantly. One evening, as the team wrapped up a long project, Margaret approached him in his office. The city lights glowed through the window behind him, casting his face in half shadow. "Thomas," she began softly, "I just want you to know how much I admire what you've built here. You've changed, in a good way." He looked up from his papers, expression unreadable. "Changed?" "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "You're stronger, more confident. It reminds me of the man I fell in love with 30 years ago." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "The same man you left when times got hard?" Her smile faltered. "I was foolish, angry, but I see now what I lost." He said nothing, letting the silence settle like a heavy curtain. Finally, he nodded toward the door. "We have work tomorrow, Margaret. Get some rest." Her eyes lingered on him, searching for a trace of warmth, but found none. She left the office quietly, and Thomas returned to his papers, unshaken. He knew this was only the beginning of her attempts, and he was ready. The following week, Margaret's efforts grew bolder. She volunteered for every major task, ensuring she would have reasons to spend more time in Thomas's office. She lingered after meetings, offering to review reports late into the evening. She even brought him coffee in the mornings, the same way she had years ago, back when she still believed in their marriage. Thomas noticed everything, but he gave nothing in return. He praised other employees openly for their contributions, yet with Margaret he kept his words clipped, professional. She was never singled out, never given the satisfaction of recognition. It unsettled her. During one team lunch, Margaret tried to revive old memories. She laughed, recalling a trip they had once taken to the coast. The younger employees listened politely, some glancing between the two of them with curiosity. Thomas remained silent until the story ended. Then he smiled faintly and shifted the conversation toward quarterly results, as though her words had meant nothing. That night, Margaret stayed late in the office. She approached his door, carrying a folder she didn't really need to deliver. Through the glass, she saw him on the phone, his expression calm, his voice low. He wasn't speaking to her, yet the warmth in his tone was unmistakable, a warmth she hadn't heard from him in years. When he ended the call and looked up, their eyes met. "Did you need something?" he asked evenly. She hesitated, then placed the folder on his desk. Just thought you could use this." He glanced at it, then at her. "Thank you, Margaret. That'll be all." Her chest tightened. She wanted him to soften, to acknowledge her efforts, but all she received was distance, deliberate, unyielding distance. And that, more than anger, stung the most. Margaret's persistence began to border on desperation. Each morning she arrived earlier, perfectly dressed, her smile practiced to hide the gnawing frustration beneath. She complimented his decisions in meetings, laughed at his rare jokes, and positioned herself as his most reliable ally. To the outside observer, she seemed devoted, even loyal. But beneath the surface, her motive was plain. She wanted him back. Thomas, however, kept his mask firmly in place. He treated her no differently than the interns just out of college. Her reports were accepted without comment. Her attempts at conversation were redirected back to work. When she lingered near his office door, he simply excused himself for another call, leaving her standing there with unspoken words caught in her throat. One afternoon, Margaret miscalculated. After a long meeting, she followed Thomas into his office, closing the door behind her. "Thomas," she began softly, her voice trembling with emotion she hadn't intended to show, "I know I hurt you. I was foolish. I didn't see what we had. What you are. I regret it every day." For the first time, he looked directly at her without his usual wall of professionalism, but his expression wasn't one of warmth. It was measured, almost clinical. "You regret the consequences, not the choice." The words struck her harder than a shout ever could. She reached for his arm, but he stepped back, maintaining that careful distance. "Margaret, this office isn't the place for personal reconciliations. You wanted to prove yourself here. Focus on that. Everything else is past." Her lips parted, but no reply came. She left his office with her mask cracked, struggling to hold back the tears. For the first time, she realized the rules of the game had changed, and she was no longer the one in control. The days that followed were a torment for Margaret. Every time Thomas walked through the office, colleagues' eyes flickered between them. She heard the hushed whispers when she passed by. "Isn't that his ex-wife? Do you think she's here because of him?" The speculation gnawed at her, feeding both her shame and her anger. She noticed, too, how other women interacted with him. Younger assistants leaned in with enthusiasm, eager to please. A manager from another department laughed freely at his dry humor. Margaret watched from across the room, her hands tightening around her pen until her knuckles turned white. Jealousy burned hot, sharper than she had expected. It wasn't just his wealth or position she craved, it was his attention, the warmth she once dismissed as weakness. But Thomas remained untouchable. He moved through the office with quiet authority, never lingering, never giving Margaret more than the same professional courtesy he extended to all. The distance between them, once unthinkable, now stretched like a canyon. One evening, as the office emptied, Margaret found herself lingering at her desk, watching through the glass walls of his office. Thomas sat with another executive, a striking woman in her 30s, their conversation animated and light. Margaret felt her stomach twist. The laughter that spilled into the hallway was like a dagger. When the women finally left, Thomas walked her to the elevator, his composure warm but formal. Margaret caught the reflection of her own face in the darkened window, eyes hollow, lips pressed thin. For the first time in years, she looked like a stranger to herself. She turned back to her desk, forcing herself to shuffle papers, but the truth clawed at her. Thomas had rebuilt his world, and she was nothing more than a shadow in it. The tension inside Margaret was no longer hidden. She began finding excuses to speak with Thomas, hovering near his office door under the guise of needing signatures or clarification. Each time, his eyes remained cool, his tone polite but clipped. It was as if her very presence had no power over him anymore, and that cut deeper than any insult could. At night, her mind replayed the past. She remembered the arguments, her sharp words, the moment she had called him a failure before walking away. Now those words returned like ghosts, whispering in her ears whenever she tried to sleep. The harder she tried to win his attention, the clearer his indifference became. One morning, unable to contain herself, Margaret approached him after a meeting. "Thomas, we should talk. About us." Her voice trembled with a mix of desperation and defiance. He paused, his expression unreadable. "There is no us, Margaret. There's work and there's history, nothing more." Her chest tightened. For years, she had been the one holding power, dictating the terms of their life. Now the balance had shifted entirely, and she was left stranded in the aftermath of her own choices. The colleagues' whispers only made it worse. Her humiliation was no longer private. It was a spectacle. She returned to her desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. The office around her buzzed with life, but for Margaret, every sound was muffled, drowned beneath the heavy weight of her realization. She was chasing something already lost, and the more she clung, the further Thomas drifted away.
Margaret's desperation began to seep through the cracks of her professional mask. She smiled too brightly at staff gatherings, laughed a little too loudly at jokes, and hovered in the break room longer than necessary, always watching, always waiting for Thomas to notice her. But his gaze never lingered. His words never strayed beyond business. The shift in power was undeniable. Once she had walked through life with certainty, knowing Thomas would bend to her moods, absorb her anger, and still come back to her. Now the roles had reversed. He was untouchable, and she was the one left trembling at every dismissive glance. One afternoon, after yet another futile attempt to draw him into conversation, she overheard two junior employees whispering near the copier. She used to be his wife, right? Now look at her, chasing after him like a schoolgirl. Their laughter burned into her ears, and Margaret fled to the restroom, her reflection in the mirror mocking her with hollow eyes and a forced smile. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat in the silence of her apartment. Once filled with laughter and warmth, it now echoed with regret. She clutched the glass tightly, whispering to herself, "He can't hate me forever. He can't." But deep down, a chilling thought took root. What if he already did, and nothing she could do would ever undo it? The realization frightened her more than anything else. For the first time in her life, Margaret was powerless, and Thomas knew it.
The next morning, Margaret arrived at work earlier than usual. She stood outside Thomas's office door for nearly 10 minutes, summoning the courage to knock. Finally, with trembling hands, she pushed it open. Thomas glanced up from his papers, calm and composed as ever. "Do you have a moment?" Her voice cracked in a way she hadn't intended. He gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. Margaret perched on the edge of the chair, twisting her hands in her lap. "Thomas, I know I made mistakes. I was cruel when you needed me most. I left you when I should have stood by you. I regret it every single day." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Please, can't we start again?" For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The only sound was the faint ticking of the office clock. Finally, Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her as though she were a stranger. "Margaret," he said evenly, "you can't rewrite history with a few tears.
You made your choice, and so did I." Her chest tightened, her desperation rising like a tide. "But I love you. I never stopped. I was scared and angry, but I always loved you. Don't shut me out forever." His eyes hardened, the faintest shadow of bitterness flickering across his face. "Love doesn't look like what you did to me. Love doesn't abandon when things get hard." Margaret reached across the desk, but he pulled back slightly, a deliberate movement that spoke louder than words. The distance between them felt insurmountable. "From this moment on," Thomas said firmly, "your place here will be determined by your work, not by the past, not by tears. Prove you can be better if you want to stay." Her breath caught. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a test. A cold, professional wall built where once there had been warmth. And Margaret knew, with a sinking heart, that if she failed this test, she would lose him forever. The following week brought with it a new tension in Margaret's every step. She felt the weight of Thomas's words pressing down on her. Your place will be determined by your work. It was no longer about their past, no longer about the 30 years they had once shared. In his eyes, she was nothing more than another employee, subject to the same scrutiny and expectations as anyone else. But Margaret knew the truth. This wasn't just a job evaluation. This was her last chance to claw her way back into his life. Thomas had given her a major account to oversee, an account notorious for its complexity and demanding clients. It was a responsibility that could make or break a career, and Margaret understood that he had chosen it deliberately. He wanted to see if she could rise to the challenge, or if her old arrogance and shortcuts would resurface. At first, she threw herself into the work with a ferocity that surprised even her colleagues. She stayed late, double-checked every report, and bit back the sharp retorts that had once come so easily to her tongue. Each time she passed Thomas in the hallway, her heart leapt, hoping he might acknowledge her effort with something, anything, more than a curt nod. But Thomas remained distant, almost coldly professional. He never praised her, never criticized her openly, only watched with those calculating eyes that seemed to measure not only her performance, but her soul. The pressure mounted. The clients were demanding, and Margaret's temper, once barely kept in check, began to fray at the edges. One late night, after a heated call with the client, she slammed the phone down, muttering curses under her breath. Unfortunately, a junior employee overheard and reported it. The next morning, Thomas summoned her to his office. "Margaret," he said calmly, hands folded on his desk, "I told you this was a test. Professionalism isn't only about delivering results. It's about how you handle yourself under pressure." Her stomach dropped. She wanted to argue, to remind him how she had carried herself tirelessly for weeks, but she saw the look in his eyes, unwavering, expectant. He wasn't searching for excuses. He was waiting to see if she would own her failure. Margaret lowered her gaze, her voice barely a whisper. I lost control. It won't happen again." Thomas nodded once, then dismissed her. No warmth, no reassurance, just the stark reality of the standard he held her to. As she left the office, Margaret felt the familiar mix of shame and desperation tightening around her throat. She had wanted to prove herself worthy of his forgiveness, but instead she had only reminded him of the woman who once tore their marriage apart.
Margaret's promise to control herself lasted only a few days before the strain began to show again. The weight of the account bore down on her like a storm she couldn't escape,
and every minor setback felt like an echo of her past failures. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the memory of Thomas's dispassionate gaze kept her clenched and silent. Her colleagues started to notice. The whispers in the office grew louder, questions asked behind closed doors. Why had the director taken such a personal interest in her? Why was she on this high-profile account so quickly? Some assumed favoritism, others sensed a hidden story. Margaret could feel the judgment in their eyes, and it gnawed at her self-control. One evening, after a particularly disastrous call with the client that left her scrambling to fix a cascade of errors, Margaret collapsed into her chair. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. The silence of the office, long emptied of most employees, was interrupted by Thomas's footsteps approaching. He paused at her desk, looking down at the scattered papers and half-written notes. "You're unraveling," he said quietly. His tone wasn't cruel, but neither was it compassionate. It was a statement of fact, sharp as glass. Margaret forced a weak smile. "I just need more time. I can do this, Thomas." He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. "It's not about time. It's about who you are when things collapse around you. That's what defines a person." The words cut deeper than she expected. For a moment, Margaret glimpsed not the director, not her ex-husband, but the man who had once stood beside her in life's storms, steady and resilient while she lashed out. Now the roles were reversed. She was the one faltering, and he was the unshakable presence watching her fail. As Thomas walked away, leaving her alone in the dim glow of the office lights, Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. She realized this was no ordinary professional test. He was holding up a mirror to her very soul, and she hated what she saw. But she also knew, if she broke now, she would lose everything forever. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the office determined to reclaim her composure. She wore her sharpest suit, painted on a confident smile, and rehearsed every word she intended to say. Yet, beneath the surface, the cracks widened. Each email, each phone call, each questioning glance from her colleagues seemed designed to test her resolve. The project Thomas had assigned her spiraled further out of control. Miscommunications piled up, deadlines slipped, and clients voiced their dissatisfaction. Margaret tried to juggle it all, but the more she clawed to regain control, the faster it all slipped away. The whispers among her coworkers no longer sounded like speculation. They carried the weight of certainty. She doesn't belong here. Late that evening, Thomas summoned her to his office. The room was quiet, the city lights burning beyond the tall windows. He gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "You've had every opportunity," he began, his voice calm, measured. "But opportunities mean nothing if you repeat the same mistakes that ruined you before." Margaret's throat tightened. "I just need—" "No," Thomas cut her off, his tone firm but not raised. "You need to face yourself. This account wasn't a test of skill, it was a test of character. And you've shown me that when pressure rises, you choose excuses over responsibility." The silence that followed pressed heavily between them. Margaret stared at him, searching for a trace of the man who once loved her, the man who had endured years of criticism, only to rise stronger when she left him broken. But his eyes were resolute, cold with finality. Margaret's facade crumbled,
Please, Thomas, don't do this to me. I can't lose this job. I can't lose you." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same detached clarity he had carried since their reunion. "You already did." Her breath caught. There was no shouting, no anger, just the brutal truth spoken without mercy. And in that moment, Margaret realized the test was over and she had failed it completely.
For the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself to speak without restraint. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. The city glittered below, a living monument to his persistence. "When you left," he began, his voice steady but low, "you thought you were escaping a sinking ship. What you didn't know was that the foundation was stronger than you ever believed." Margaret blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" He turned, meeting her eyes with unflinching resolve. "The money. The nights I spent away. You thought I was wasting my life, gambling like a fool. But those games, those risks, gave me $3 million. Locked away by contract, untouchable until the right time. I never told you, because I wanted to prove myself without leaning on it." Her lips parted, shock etched across her face. "$3 million?" Thomas nodded. "I endured your scorn, your anger, your abandonment. And when the day came, the money was released. I built everything you see around you, not with luck, but with discipline, with resilience, with the kind of loyalty you never showed me." Margaret's breath trembled as she shook her head. "I didn't know. If you had," Thomas interrupted, his tone cutting, "you would have stayed for the money, not for me. And that's why I never told you. I needed to see your truth, and I did." The office felt colder than ever. Margaret's carefully constructed defenses shattered beneath the weight of his words. She realized then that she hadn't just lost a husband. She had lost the one chance to stand beside a man who had risen above betrayal. Thomas exhaled slowly, the finality clear. "You asked for forgiveness, but forgiveness does not erase truth. And the truth is, you left me when I needed you most. That can never be undone." Margaret lowered her gaze, her body trembling with silent sobs. The silence in the room was broken only by the ticking clock, each second marking the distance between them growing irreversibly wider. Margaret stood frozen, the weight of his revelation pressing her deeper into despair. The room felt suffocating, the glittering skyline beyond the glass mocking her with everything she had thrown away. Her tears streaked down her face, but Thomas remained unmoved, arms folded, expression carved in stone. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I was wrong. I was blind and cruel, but I love you. I always did. Thomas raised a hand, silencing her. "Love without loyalty is nothing but words, Margaret. You left when life tested us, and now you want to return because the storm has passed?" She stepped closer, desperation thick in her voice. "Give me one more chance. Let me prove I can change. I'll do anything." His gaze narrowed, calculating, as if weighing not her words, but her worth. "Then prove it," he said coldly. "Not as my wife, that door is closed, but as my employee. You begged for work, and I gave you a position. Earn it. Show me you can serve something beyond yourself." Margaret's breath hitched.
The humiliation was sharp, cutting deeper than she thought possible. To go from wife to subordinate, it was unthinkable. Yet the alternative was darker: unemployment, loneliness, and the knowledge that she had thrown away everything for pride. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into their palms. The silence stretched, forcing her to confront the truth. She could cling to her shattered dignity, walk out and lose him forever, or swallow her pride and survive. Finally, she nodded, her voice breaking. "I'll do it. I'll stay." Thomas gave no smile, no relief, only a curt nod. "Then tomorrow you come in at 8 a.m. sharp. And Margaret," he paused, his eyes cold as winter steel, "you're not special here. You'll be judged as everyone else. Fail once and you're gone." Margaret lowered her head, tears dripping onto the polished floor. She had chosen survival, but the taste of it was bitter. The man she once called her husband had become her judge, and she was nothing more than another desperate soul in his empire. For the first time in her life, Margaret understood what true power and true loss felt like.
The following morning, Margaret arrived at the office before sunrise. She sat in her car for a long while, staring at the building where she once imagined herself as the wife of its director. Now she would walk through the same glass doors as an employee, anonymous, replaceable, insignificant. When she entered, the receptionist barely glanced at her. No one whispered her name, no one welcomed her with warmth. To them, she was just another woman desperate for a paycheck. And perhaps that anonymity was the cruelest punishment of all. At 8 a.m. sharp, Margaret stood at her desk, waiting for instructions. Thomas walked past with two managers, his suit immaculate, his face unreadable. He didn't spare her a single glance. The indifference stung more than any insult could. Once she had been the center of his world. Now she was invisible. The day dragged on with tasks she had long considered beneath her: organizing files, drafting reports, assisting with presentations she didn't understand. Her colleagues offered polite smiles, but nothing more. They whispered behind her back, the way people always did when they sensed weakness. During lunch, Margaret caught sight of Thomas across the cafeteria. He was seated with a group of executives, laughing at something one of them had said. His posture was relaxed, his confidence radiating like a shield. Margaret couldn't look away. That was the man she had abandoned, the man who had risen higher than she ever dreamed. And he hadn't needed her at all. The days turned into weeks. Margaret forced herself to arrive early and leave late, terrified of making even the smallest mistake. Thomas never addressed her directly, except through formal memos or curt instructions. Their conversations were stripped of warmth, reduced to professional exchanges that left her feeling like a stranger. And yet, beneath his distance, Margaret felt his eyes on her, not with tenderness, but with scrutiny. He was testing her, measuring whether she could endure the humiliation she had once so easily inflicted on him. Every night, when she returned to her empty apartment, Margaret collapsed into silence. The bed was cold, the walls felt like a cage, and in those lonely hours, she realized what true regret was: a slow, gnawing ache that no apology could soothe. She had traded love for pride, and now pride had left her with nothing but the hollow comfort of survival. Winter settled over the city, and with it came a heavy stillness that mirrored Margaret's heart. Each day at the office followed the same pattern: arrive early, bury herself in work,
endure the silence from Thomas, and though he never once raised his voice, the weight of his indifference pressed on her more than any outburst could have. One evening, long after most employees had left, Margaret stayed behind to complete a report. She looked up when she sensed movement. Thomas stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back. For a fleeting second, she hoped he might speak to her like he once had, with warmth, with recognition. Instead, he only said, "You've left a typo on page 3. Fix it before morning." His tone was level, professional, mercilessly distant. As he walked away, Margaret's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Once upon a time, she had dreamed of hearing his voice late at night, sharing secrets, laughter, promises. Now the only words she heard from him were corrections. Her colleagues began to notice. Some pitied her, others mocked her in hushed conversations. "Imagine," one whispered, "being the ex-wife of the boss and still treated like a temp." The words cut deep, but Margaret endured. Pride had once driven her to leave Thomas. Now it chained her in shame. At home, she replayed their past in fragments. The day of their wedding, the nights they stayed up talking until dawn, the arguments that grew sharper as the years wore on. She remembered the days she walked out, the door closing behind her as she told herself she deserved better. That memory returned like a knife every time she saw Thomas stride confidently through the office, untouchable, thriving without her. The regret was no longer a passing thought. It was her constant companion, echoing through every empty room she returned to at night. She had gambled everything, her marriage, her dignity, her future, and lost. And now Thomas was making her live with that loss, not through cruelty, but through something far worse: cold professionalism. Spring approached, and with it came a sense of renewal that Margaret could not feel. The office hummed with anticipation of new contracts, new ventures, but for her, every day was a test she feared failing. She noticed how Thomas moved through meetings, commanding attention, respected by peers and subordinates alike. He had become everything she once wished he could be, only without her by his side. One morning, Thomas summoned her to his office. His tone was firm, but not unkind. "Margaret, we have a major project coming in. I want you to lead the initial proposal draft." She blinked in surprise. It was the first time he had entrusted her with responsibility beyond clerical tasks. Her heart raced with hope, though his eyes remained unreadable. "This is your chance to prove yourself," he continued. "The board will review it next month. If you succeed, you'll earn your place here. If not, well, you know the outcome." Margaret nodded quickly, clutching the folder he handed her. "I won't disappoint you," she whispered, her voice trembling. For weeks, she poured everything into the project. Late nights at the office, endless revisions, chasing details until exhaustion blurred her vision. Yet through it all, Thomas remained distant, offering only brief comments when she submitted drafts. Too vague. Needs numbers. Try again. She longed for encouragement, for even a sliver of warmth, but none came. When presentation day arrived, Margaret stood before the board, hands shaking but words steady. She outlined the proposal with precision, weaving together her research, her determination, her desperation. As she spoke, she risked a glance at Thomas. He listened intently, expression neutral, revealing nothing. When it ended, the board murmured their approval. One by one, heads nodded. "Solid work," one director said. Another added, "Stronger than expected." Relief washed over Margaret. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe. Afterwards, Thomas approached her in the corridor. "You did well," he said simply. No smile, no warmth, just acknowledgement. But to Margaret it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She had passed his test. She had earned her place. And yet, even in her small triumph, a hollow ache lingered. Because no matter how hard she worked, no matter what approval she gained, she knew it could never give her back the one thing she truly wanted: his love.
The weeks following Margaret's success settled into an uneasy rhythm. She now held more responsibility, and colleagues gradually began to respect her for her work rather than whispering about her past. Yet the air between her and Thomas never softened. He treated her with the same tone he used for anyone else in the company: professional, measured, distant. At first, she told herself that this was progress. She had clawed her way back into relevance, and perhaps in time the walls between them would crumble. But the longer it went on, the more she realized those walls weren't temporary. They were permanent, unyielding, built not from anger, but from something far colder: indifference. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, she lingered in his office doorway. "Thomas," she said softly, almost pleadingly, I wanted to thank you for giving me another chance." He looked up from his papers, expression calm, voice steady. "You earned it, Margaret. That's all." The simplicity of his words struck her harder than any insult ever could. There was no warmth in them, no hidden affection, no unspoken hope. She had fought to prove herself, and she had. But it was only a professional victory, nothing more. From then on, Margaret buried herself in her duties. She avoided bringing up the past, avoided any attempt at personal conversation. It was clear he would not indulge her, and she had begun to understand that forcing the matter would only deepen the distance. Still, at night, when she sat alone in her small apartment, she could not stop replaying the moments of their marriage, both the bitter arguments and the fleeting glimpses of tenderness. She wondered what would have happened if she had stayed, if she had trusted him during his struggles. But such thoughts only sharpened her regret. Thomas, on the other hand, slept soundly. He had found peace not in revenge, but in detachment. Margaret's presence no longer stirred anger or longing in him. She was simply an employee. And that, more than anything else, was the truest punishment of all.
The months rolled on with quiet predictability. Margaret performed her tasks with diligence, steadily gaining recognition among her colleagues, though she knew that every nod of approval from them meant little compared to the silence she received from Thomas. He continued to treat her exactly as he did others, no more, no less. The consistency of it was maddening. Sometimes, during office gatherings, she would catch herself watching him from across the room. He laughed easily with others, spoke with confidence, and commanded respect without ever raising his voice. To everyone else, he was an accomplished leader. To her, he was the man she had once shared a life with, and the man who now looked at her as if she had never been anything more than a stranger. One Friday evening, she walked home beneath the city lights, her thoughts heavy. She passed by a restaurant they used to visit decades ago. For a moment, she lingered outside the window, watching couples seated together, their hands intertwined, their laughter spilling over plates of food. It hurt to think that she had once had that and thrown it away in anger and impatience. The sharp ache of regret pressed down on her chest until she forced herself to keep walking. Thomas, meanwhile, rarely spared her a thought outside of work. He had trained himself to compartmentalize, to draw lines between duty and sentiment. To him, the past was a story already concluded, its chapters closed. But in the quiet moments, late at night or in the stillness of an early morning, he occasionally reflected on the choices that had brought him here. He did not feel bitterness anymore. Instead, there was only clarity. Betrayal had changed him, but it had also set him free. And so they lived, side by side in the same building, yet separated by an invisible chasm that could never be bridged. Each knew it, though only one of them still hoped otherwise.
Winter settled over the city, coating the streets with a pale frost that glistened beneath the dim streetlights. In the office, the season brought longer evenings and a quiet, almost reflective mood. Margaret found herself slowing down at her desk sometimes, her pen hovering above the page as her thoughts drifted. She had become efficient, competent, even respected, but nothing in her career eased the hollowness inside her. Her colleagues now praised her diligence. Some even confided in her, treating her as a reliable figure in the team. It was ironic. She had earned the respect here that she had once demanded from Thomas in their marriage. But respect from strangers did not warm her at night, nor did it silence the voice in her head that whispered of everything she had thrown away. One late afternoon, while finishing a report, Margaret looked up and caught Thomas's reflection in the glass wall of his office. He was leaning over his desk, speaking with another executive, his expression calm but resolute. She remembered the days when that same man had seemed small to her, weighed down by financial struggles she could not tolerate. The memory struck her like a knife. How little faith she had shown in him, how quickly she had condemned him. And now he stood taller than she had ever imagined, while she was left on the outside, peering in. That night she sat in her apartment, the silence suffocating. On her nightstand lay an old photo of them, taken in their 20s before the bitterness had seeped into her heart. She studied it for a long time, tears welling in her eyes. She realized then that time had not merely stolen her husband, it had stolen the chance to ever undo what she had done. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his life with steady precision. He bore no anger toward her anymore, but neither did he feel sympathy. In his mind, Margaret had made her choices, and he had made his. The past was not a wound now, but a scar, a reminder of both pain and survival. And as snow fell outside, blanketing the city in silence, the two of them remained trapped in parallel lives, one moving forward with quiet resolve, the other forever circling the ruins of her regret.
Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow into streams that carried away the remnants of winter. The world outside felt renewed, yet inside Margaret's heart there was no such thaw. She had come to terms with her role at the company, performing with discipline and silence, but each day carried with it the reminder of her place in Thomas's world, never beside him, only beneath his leadership. She no longer sought his attention in meetings, nor did she linger in hallways in hopes of catching his eye. That stage had passed. Her obsession had burned down into embers of weary acceptance. Still, there were moments, late at night, when she would close her eyes and imagine his hand in hers, as if she could rewind time. But dawn always shattered those illusions. Thomas, meanwhile, had reached a point of equilibrium. Success no longer excited him, it simply was.
His investments flourished, his leadership held steady, and his circle of trusted allies expanded beyond the office. To his colleagues, he was a figure of discipline and foresight. To Margaret, he was a constant reminder of what she had underestimated, what she had abandoned. One afternoon, Thomas stayed late to finish a board proposal. Passing by Margaret's desk, he paused briefly, not to speak, but simply to observe. She was focused, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a fleeting moment, he remembered the woman he had once loved. The same determination, the same sharpness of mind. But that moment vanished quickly, replaced by the unshakable truth. The woman he had once loved no longer existed, at least not for him. Margaret noticed his shadow as he walked away, but she did not call out. There was nothing left to say. Words had once been her weapon, then her plea, but now silence was all that remained between them. That night, Margaret walked home beneath blooming trees, petals scattering across the pavement like fragments of an old memory. She realized then that her punishment was not his coldness or distance. It was the life she now lived, stripped of warmth she could never recover. Thomas, too, understood something as he looked out from his office window at the same blossoms. Betrayal had shaped him, strengthened him, but it had also freed him. And freedom, he decided, was worth more than reconciliation could ever be.
Summer sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Thomas's office. The city outside moved on, unaware of the quiet end unfolding within these walls. Margaret sat across from Thomas, her hands folded tightly, her eyes hollow with years of regret. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no final plea. What remained between them now was clarity, sharp, undeniable, and absolute. Thomas signed the last of the quarterly reports and closed the file, his movements calm, deliberate. Without looking up, he spoke in a steady tone. "From here on, Margaret, your position will remain as it is. You've proven you can work. That's enough." There was no malice in his voice, no lingering bitterness, only finality. She nodded, unable to muster words. She had once dreamed of sitting beside him again, perhaps even reclaiming the place she had abandoned. But those dreams had eroded under the weight of time and consequence. All she had now was the small measure of survival he allowed her. When she left the room, Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring out over the skyline. The journey had come full circle. The man she had called a failure had risen, rebuilt, and surpassed everything she had believed possible. He felt no triumph in her defeat, only a quiet acknowledgement of the distance between them. Some wounds never healed. They simply became part of who you were. Margaret walked home that evening alone, her heels echoing on the pavement. The world bustled around her, but in her chest lay a silence that no sound could break. She knew, finally, that her story with Thomas was over, not in fiery rage, not in forgiveness, but in a cold permanence that would follow her until her last day. Thomas closed the blinds of his office and allowed himself a rare smile, not of joy, but of peace. The past no longer owned him. His life was his own, untethered, unburdened. Betrayal had not broken him, it had refined him.
This story was never about reunion or second chances. It was about truth, that choices have weight, that betrayal can cut deeper than time can heal, and that dignity often lies in walking forward, not looking back. Thomas's resilience reminds us that strength can emerge from heartbreak, but it is never without cost. Margaret's downfall is not simply punishment, it is the echo of her decisions, the inevitable return of the seeds she once planted. Now, I want to ask you, dear listeners, do you believe Margaret's regret was enough to redeem her in any way, or are some betrayals truly beyond forgiveness?